Welcome, everybody. Could we... Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody. If we could start to sit down, please, and we can get started. It's quite a tight timeline. As you wish. Yes. David is sitting there. Please, please come in and sit down. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. Welcome to our conversation on conflict. I'm going to steal this part. Welcome, everybody, to our conversation on trends in conflict. We're delighted that you're here. I hope everybody can sit down and get a coffee and join us. My name is Cliona Rowley. I am the president and founder of ACLED and a professor of political geography at the University of Sussex. I'm here today with three very esteemed guests who will be answering some questions on the patterns of violence, and then we're hoping to open up the discussion for about 10 to 15 minutes for people in the room. So with that underway, I'll get started. To my left immediately is His Excellency Dr. Ahmed Al-Ansari, advisor to the Prime Minister and official spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar. And he's also the director of the Center for International Policy Research. He is welcome to expand on that as he wishes in just a second. To his left is Achim Steiner, the administrator for the United Nations Development Programme. Of course, there is extensive leadership experience in international policymaking addressing environmental sustainability and social equity. And last but certainly not least is David Miliband, the President and CEO of International Rescue Committee, of course the former Foreign Secretary from 2007-2010 for the United Kingdom. So with that, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for agreeing to join us today. So, we're here to discuss, of course, a conversation on global conflict patterns. And as we know, and certainly from the current Munich Security Conference book, it's been a bit of a lose-lose situation in the last few years. And in fact, we're experiencing a decline in global cooperation and a severe downturn in security. As we grapple with multiple international wars and a massive humanitarian crisis, rising nationalism from significant powers, and sustained violence in post-conflict states, there's been a drastic rise in both the number of non-state violent groups and the repression by increasingly autocratic governments. I think it's fair to say that the democratic peace has largely been destroyed, and conflicts are evolving much faster than our ability to understand or address them. And so today with this esteemed group, we're going to discuss three trends. The first motivates this discussion, and as I just mentioned, conflict is rising and it's taking several different forms. Conflict has demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt and evolve to the changing political environments in which it occurs. So there is election violence, of course, in places like India and Pakistan. There have been death squads in the Philippines. There are hundreds of anti- and pro-government groups in Myanmar. Of course, since the pandemic alone, the number of events has gone up 22% for violent events, and 1 in 6 of us are now living in a place of active conflict. And it's not solely because, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine or Israel's response to Hamas in Gaza. Conflict is not clustering just there. In fact, all of the conflict-affected places that I've just mentioned, and of course we can mention more, means that being a conflict-affected country is no longer an exceptional case. It is far more normal than it used to be. Our second trend is that conflict is not solely a scourge of low-income states. We've actually seen that conflict is increasing most quickly in middle-income states and states that have taken on some democratic practices. So it is not a result of state weakness or fragility, but it is persistent in countries with those characteristics. And finally, of course, I think we can all agree that conflict has become far more complex, and the fallout from peace-building and stabilization efforts has led to an unprecedented rise in militias, gangs, and mobs. Conflict threats are now overwhelmingly from these non-state armed groups, and they expose 4 to 5 times more people than traditional insurgent groups. So, with that, I'm going to start with question 1. All that cheery news. I'll start with question 1. And actually to Achim, if you don't mind, first, and then of course, please come in. The overall state of conflict has shifted several times since 1946. From the end of history at the tail end of the Cold War to now, conflict rates have both increased and conflict forms have changed. As I mentioned, political gangs and militias expose 4 times more people than rebel violence does. There has been an explosion in the number of militias and gangs, and these groups are ideologically weak, numerically strong, less likely to cooperate, and more likely to shift local politics. So what specific challenges does this shift represent for conflict management and response? And how can political and security actors overcome these? Please, you start. And
thank you very much, and great pleasure to join you, especially with such a distinguished panel here. So let me just offer a couple of reflections, because particularly when you take into account the moment in which we meet and the place in which we're meeting here, the Munich Security Conference, I want to begin by perhaps challenging a little bit this notion that very often when conflicts happen, begin to define our response as if it is the beginning of the conflict, the armed conflict, that actually defines the chronology of events that leads up to it. And I think very often we then find ourselves in the kind of public discourse we are now having, which is you're forced to respond, you are in reflex mode, and you also have to deal with a public that is at least carrying a deep sense of disruption, whether it is now the conflict in Europe, whether it is Israel and Gaza, whether it is also the conflicts that are happening in other parts of the world. And you know, in UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, we work in virtually every country, as do you, where there is conflict or crisis right now. But I think the typology of these conflicts and crises are perhaps not necessarily as new as we sometimes assume they are. I mean, if you take a situation such as in Ecuador, yes, there is a particular evolution there around a narco-criminal, narco-terrorist dimension that has now really begun to destabilize a whole country. The invasion of Russia of Ukraine, the conflict that is decades old in the Middle East. So these typologies, in a sense, are not necessarily what has changed. I think it is partly the scale, the magnitude, more refugees, more internally displaced people than at any point since 1945. That's a numerical indicator. But then we have, and this is really where my point is trying to broaden our lens, we need to go back to also the root causes. Because ultimately, is war the cause, or is it actually an effect? Is it a symptom of failures? And again, we don't have time now to go into very different typologies here, but I certainly feel that there is a degree to which the world right now is redefining security, again, in a very narrow sense of protecting security. And yet the UNDP Human Development Report a couple of years ago found something very interesting, because as we surveyed people across the world, the sense of insecurity was remarkable. 6 out of 7 people feel insecure. Now, not to go into definitions, but to me this was profoundly disturbing, because if that is the level to which people are uncertain about what happens next, you create a climate in which people become more fearful, they become more fearful of the other, they begin to define the enemy, populism begins to find ground, anger is a very great currency in which to trade when you're trying to deal with political domestic situations. And suddenly you have conflicts breaking out in countries that don't fit the traditional pattern of, you know, undemocratic, poor, unresolved issues. Remember what happened on the stairs of the Congress in the United States. Think back to Chile. These were not classical countries on anybody's risk radar as being prone to having major domestic conflicts suddenly break out. The second aspect that I'd like to perhaps point to is that I think also here at the Munich Security Conference over a number of years now, the discussion has tried to let's say, broaden that interpretation of security. Some of the greatest threats to the future of humankind in 2024 are not only the conflicts that are happening, but are the unresolved responses to the next pandemic, climate change in all its consequences, the advent of the digital, artificial intelligence, quantum computing economy, in which suddenly those who can advance fast can leave entire parts of the world behind. But more importantly, cyber warfare and other issues become very prevalent. What is interesting here, and our next Human Development Report that will be issued in a couple of weeks' time in 2024, points to 3 issues that I just want to leave as part of our discussion. What is different today is that the degree of interdependence in actually tackling these great risks is far more profound than it has ever been. In part because it is also a planetary dimension now, but also more traditional things. If you want to deal with cyber warfare, cyber crime and the threats, you can't solve them by firewalling your economy. The notion that in this current climate we will deglobalize, I think, is of limited relevance because we cannot deplanetize, and this deals with the whole issue of climate change. So that degree of interdependence at the moment is something we have to find a way in which to juxtaposition with that very populist, inward-looking reflex that is actually undermining our very capacity to deal with it. Global public goods, I think, is something that may provide us with a better frame to redefine some shared interests. And here, perhaps just a brief remark. There are too many conversations today that begin by saying that I will talk to you if you agree with what I believe. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we call it shared norms, international rules-based order. We have rules, rules-based orders, and we see the world breaking them left, right, and center. So we're also at a point in time where the level of trust to solve problems and conflicts is perhaps at its lowest level in a long time. So maybe we need to go back to basics and start asking ourselves, where is our shared interest in tackling something? And by beginning to tackle it together, shared norms can emerge. And finally, I think agency. We live in a very contradictory time. People, talk about democracy, about people's ability to articulate their political views, choose their governments. Yes, we live in a time where more agency is possible, and some of that agency is producing outcomes that are very disturbing. Radicalization is part of democracy at the moment. So how do we counter this sense of disempowerment that makes citizens vote almost against the very thing that they're using to exercise their agency? And I think we need to go back to those conversations because the conflicts of today and tomorrow that are beginning to spiral out of control have a lot to do with the relationship between people and the state that has basically lost its functionality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's excellent. I'm going to jump now to David in order to pick up some of these threads. Achim mentioned this being a contradictory time, and as I noted, conflict rates are growing fastest in somewhat unexpected places, middle income and democratizing places. Now, as somebody who worked, of course, and was, I believe, the Shadow Secretary for DFID, I'm curious about your approach to conflict, given its new geography and its new intensity.
Well, I was never the Shadow Secretary for DFID, so let me just go back a couple of steps. I represent the International Rescue Committee, which is a global humanitarian charity NGO that tries to help people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster to survive, recover, and gain control of their futures. And I agree with Achim very much that it's important in this discussion to separate symptoms from causes. But I'm going to disagree with him very strongly about whether we should see this as a global issue for 193 countries or actually go in and focus on a much smaller number of countries. And I'll do this partly just to be argumentative, but also partly because I really want to try and bring out the following point. We know that there are 54 civil conflicts going on around the world at the moment. We also know that there are 10 in which the number of battlefield deaths in the last year has been greater than 1,000, which makes them count as severe. And what I want to point this discussion towards is 20 countries, and I choose that number because we've just published our emergency watch list for humanitarian need in 2024. And these 20 countries represent 86% of total humanitarian need around the world. So I'm not saying that the other 14% don't matter, but I think for some problems, the Eisenhower doctrine that you should enlarge the problem to solve it is appropriate. In this, if we enlarge the problem beyond the 20, we're just going to get lost. And I'm not going to go into cybersecurity. I'm not going to go into a whole range of other things. So let's just focus on those 20 countries. 86% of humanitarian need. 14 of the 20 countries, this picks up something that Achim said, 14 of the 20 countries are in the Notre Dame index of the top quartile for climate vulnerability. So the overlap between conflict and the climate crisis is growing very strongly. Third point, these conflicts are long-term. 7 of the top 10 have not had a year of peace in the last 10 years. So the protracted nature of the conflict. And the fourth factor I just want to pick out is that these conflicts, I've slightly lost the number, I think it's 15 of the top 20, but it's a general trend. These are what are called internationalized civil conflicts. The old idea of a civil war was that it involved domestic actors. It's increasingly evident that we're seeing international actors playing an increasing role, international state actors playing an increasing role. And so just to pick a prototypical example, number 1 on our watch list is Sudan. Right? Gaza and West Bank are number 2, South Sudan is number 3. Sudan, as you all know, major states are supporting the Sudan Armed Forces, major states are supporting the rebel groups. And so it's a very good example of 25 million people in humanitarian need. Yes, there's a climate element. It's picking up from previous conflict, and it's got internationalized elements. And I think that the really hard exam question is how to do peace building and peacemaking in that kind of circumstance. Those people who know Sudan much better than I do will tell you that the drumbeat that they're seeing today is all too reminiscent of 20 years ago. And that poses really fundamental questions for what the international system does, what local actors do. We have an operation which has had to move its headquarters from Khartoum. Khartoum's been depopulated. I just want to make a couple of points, though, about how we think about this situation today. One, the stabilizers of the global system are weakening. Those stabilizers could be multilateral institutions. Those stabilizers could be balance of power. But we're seeing a weakening of the stabilizers, the guardrails, if you like. Secondly, there's greater and greater impunity in the 20 countries. Conflict is more marked by impunity, but perhaps, I would say yes, linked to the fact that internationalized conflict, if it's someone else's people who are being killed, there's less of a personal connection, there's greater impunity. And that feels highly relevant. Thirdly, there's much, as Achim picked this up, much greater displacement, not just refugees and asylum seekers, but internally displaced as well. And so the tumult is growing. The final point I just want to pick out on this, the ratio of civilian deaths to military deaths is rising. So the figure we quote is 90% of deaths in conflict today are civilians, which is extraordinary. But also the ratio of displaced people to deaths is growing. Syria being a very prime example of that. So our take is that we're a humanitarian agency, and the first step to development is to stop things getting worse, so humanitarian aid is the first step to development. We should come back, I don't want to speak for too long, we should come back to your point about middle income versus lower income, because as the figures I've suggested to point out, Ukraine and Israel, Gaza are unusual in our experience rather than usual in being sites of conflict. But I'd love to come back to some of those points in the course of the discussion.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I'm actually going to jump to Majid, if I could. So when we spoke earlier about needing new solutions, Qatar has been really in the forefront of trying to broker some very difficult agreements. And of course, I'm going to ask whether or not the deals that Qatar has helped come about, if they have been marred, I think, by how the drivers effectively for the would-be peacemakers are very challenging to deal with currently. And of course, are the current problems specific to these conflicts, or is there a general trend that Qatar has hoped to work on, such as, for example, cooperation or shared norms?
Thank you. I mean, I do agree with a lot that's been said by Akam and David regarding conflict around the world today, and I just want to add a couple of things before I get to your question. One, I think one of the main threats we are facing right now is the convergence of violence. Violent conflict and the drivers of violence have been converging around the world in a way that is unprecedented, but also very indicative of what might happen in the future in a lot of regions around the world. I'm talking here about things like terrorist networks utilizing electoral violence and political violence in countries around Africa, for example, in building relations with human traffickers and weapon smugglers, right? So you have this convergence of all of these problems coming in. And if you look at the map today of well, the old world, you'll see a line that begins with the Atlantic Ocean and ends with the borders of China, of instability that is consistent throughout the map. Right? And you'll see all of these violent actors, non-state violent actors, and some state-sponsored violent actors moving freely within that area. And I think this is very dangerous for our future. We are going to see a resurgence of international terrorism in a way that we have not seen before. And then added to that is the convergence in radicalization of youth. We've been always, all of us, optimistic about the younger generations, right? In all the surveys and all the polls, you always find the most positive tendencies within the younger cohorts in any society. But what we've been seeing, and the polling suggests this, in so many countries, that there is a difference now. Young men, are more likely to be radical than older men in so many contexts around the world today. And what is happening around us, the Ukraine situation, the situation in Gaza, is increasing this level of radicalization to unprecedented levels. And this is a generation being raised on the idea of violence being the only way out, the only solution, and without hope. And a people without hope is a people ready to be recruited into any claim of violence. And another thing I think worthy to talk about is the lack of leadership. And I know that it's been a cliche now. All of us always talk about the lack of leadership. But it's so multi-layered now, the lack of leadership, that you see it on a societal level, on a state level, on an international level, in a way that allows for that void to be filled by actors, non-rational actors, whether they be leaders in countries that don't abide by the international system principles, they don't abide by the rule-based system, they don't abide by common sense when it comes to leading their own countries. And we've seen that in countries around the world with leaders saying things that were just unimaginable 10 or 15 years ago. And along with that is a short-termism in policy around the world today. We are all, chasing electoral cycles. The idea of a sustainable push, of a sustainable foreign policy, a sustainable international framework has gone out of the window for a cause of just getting to the next electoral cycle and just getting through the next electoral cycle. And it's becoming damning in a lot of situations, including what we are seeing right now in Gaza, where electoral and political posturing is one of the main reasons why we are facing so much difficulty now in the mediation process. And it talks about the final point I want to make on conflict is the problem, and it was alluded to, the lack of trust internationally. Our trust in our leaders, the trust in the international community, and for good reason, right? It's not like there is no reason for this lack of trust. It's not a byproduct of propaganda and rhetoric and narrative. It is the reality that what makes us trust our governments to deliver when it comes to security, prosperity, is almost non-existent in a lot of countries around the world today. What makes us trust that the international system that was built to protect our safety and security around the world is able to do so, that is almost now non-existent with the current conflict. And the fact that even on the societal level, we have seen an increase of societal groups that are choosing violent methods, corruption, and other means to advance their own social portfolios rather than using the system itself, in a complete collapse of bridging social capital within the institutions and a lot of the states around the world. What's the way out of this? Of course, it's a very bleak picture that all of us are talking about around here. But I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a need for small and medium countries around the world, the middle powers, to take an advantage of a consortium with institutions like ACM's and David's, the NGOs of the international NGOs of the world, but also the international organizations, to work together to fill the void created by great power competition. And this is one thing that Qatar has been doing for a long time now. We are small enough to be able to mediate and to facilitate in cases where others would shy away from. Our location we don't have any shortcoming of conflicts and problems in our region, so we have the experience to deal with these conflicts, sadly. And our experience as an energy supplier and as a logistics hub, because I can't tell you how useful that is within the process itself. Working through all of these LNG deals all around the world gave our people, the negotiation methods, experience, tactics, and relationships to peg on when it comes to peace facilitation. When we invest in oil exploration in countries in Africa, that opens the door for mediation and peace facilitation. When we are working with countries like Iran, like Russia on energy, it's also very useful to have that relationship. And it's important also to have political will, because we're a small country, we're a prosperous country. We can avoid conflict for as much as that is possible. But I don't believe we can be complacent in the international community today. We have to pay dividend into our prosperity and security internationally. And if we have the means to be a peace facilitator, we have the means to mediate, we have the means to bring about a peaceful resolution to conflict, then we should do so for our own national interest. Along with the fact that we, in Qatar, we've always been, the whole country was built on the idea of being a Mecca for the oppressed. That's using terminology used by the founding father of Qatar in one of his poems. So that was always part of what we're doing. Right now, we are reuniting Ukrainian children with their families in the mediation between Russia and Ukraine. We are mediating between Venezuela and the United States, Iran and the United States, of course, up to 7th of October, Hamas and Israel. And we're working with other files also to make sure that we can leave that imprint here and there. And I can tell you that it's growingly difficult to face the challenges of mediation, and I'll end with that point. One of the main issues we're facing right now is an issue of capacity around the world. Do we have the capacity to deal with conflict and the aftermath of conflict when we have so many conflicts with international focus today? David, you mentioned Sudan. Sudan has been forgotten by the international community because it's overshadowed by Russia, Ukraine, by Gaza, by what's happening around the world. And I'm afraid that will only get worse as we go along. There's no solution around it because we have limited capacity as an international community. And this is why, I say, middle power, small countries, medium countries need to jump in to fill that void. If, as David said very rightly, if we are able to focus our efforts, a country like Qatar can focus on 3-4 conflicts and then push as much as possible for these conflicts to at least be frozen enough for the humanitarian situation to be addressed, rather than ending conflict, which is always eluded anybody who's working on peace resolution at the moment and peace facilitation. I think that will help us take it a step further. The problem is we all get, I'm sorry, I'll end with this anecdote. I was in a zoo once, and what do they call the animals? I forgot the name of the animal, but I was looking at a cage, and they're all digging for food. And whenever one of them finds something, all of them go and jump to that place. And they start digging. And obviously, they have limited food over there. And then one of them would just venture off and go in another place. And then all of them would go. That's what's happening to us in the international community today. We all jump on one thing, and then we get in each other's ways when it comes to mediation and peace facilitation. And you'll have all of these state actors either sponsoring conflict or failing to produce outcomes, while we are forgetting about other conflicts, and we need to compartmentalize in a way to make that happen. As I said, we're working right now on all of these issues, but the capacity in the international community, I think, is the main challenge we're facing right now.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Actually, to pick up on that, I would love if David and Akim could speak about what do you think we need to be investing our time and resources in to meet the challenges? We all clearly have a little bit of a difference in what we prioritize when it comes to characterizing conflict, and I think that whether it's unseen conflicts or ignored conflicts, I'm wondering what strategies for addressing these complex challenges just don't get enough attention yet, but should be very much part of our toolbox.
Let me just make 2 quick points, because I know you want to go to questions from the audience. First of all, I think what both my colleagues here have said is important, but I want to pick up something that Majid said. Rights to civilian protection and rights to humanitarian aid are absolute. They shouldn't be contingent on mediation. And what we're seeing in more and more places is a conflation of mediation for peacemaking with mediation for the delivery of food or the delivery of humanitarian aid. And I'm not just talking about Gaza, there's elsewhere as well. This is really dangerous. When we talk about the rules and norms of the international order, if we cannot uphold the right for civilians to be safe from fire and to have access to humanitarian aid, we're in the deepest of deep trouble. And it seems to me that we've gone a long way backwards, and the norm is now becoming that you can use food as a weapon of war rather than that it should be stopped from such. So I want us to make sure that we have mediation in the right box. There's mediation, but there's also assertion of rights. Secondly, I think we've got to be really careful to distinguish a legal failure, which is the failure to deliver humanitarian aid, because that's a right, from state failure, from wider system failure. Those are different, and they'll need different tools for addressing them. And the fundamental problem, I believe, that makes this period different from the Cold War, but frankly different from the pre-Cold War period as well, is that sovereignty, state sovereignty, is being used as a shield against international engagement on issues of state failure. And if you think back 15, 20 years, the whole debate about responsibility to protect was designed to take on the idea that when states are failing in their responsibilities to their own citizens in violation of the UN Charter, there was international responsibility. That's been flipped in the last 10 or 15 years. And this idea that state sovereignty is used as a shield against international engagement is what's leaving hundreds of millions of civilians in such an exposed position. But if we get confused between what are the responsibilities of states and what are responsibilities of the wider system, we're going to end up in trouble.
So many things to respond to, but I want to appeal for a moment to David, because I think we are speaking about a continuum of challenges. We first met when you were Environment Secretary. Then you became Secretary, what's it called in the UK? Foreign Affairs, right? Yes, FCO at the time. And I think, David, what we all, I think, believe, and what you also alluded to, is we need to both respond to crisis and conflict, and the numbers are going up, they're becoming more protracted, more complicated. But we also need to, and that's my point, think more carefully to your question about how to have early warning, about how to recognize where things are beginning to fall apart. The notion of prevention, I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence here, is an obvious one. So the question is, are we able to respond earlier and more systematically? And this is where many of the phenomena you have both described just now about the state of our world is actually paralyzing our ability to something that we didn't do very well in the past, but that we could do a lot better. Let me just point to a country such as Myanmar. The world has turned away from Myanmar. Anybody who follows it, and I have to at the moment, qua my position, can see that we have a red light flashing there, but the world is busy somewhere else. Sudan is a crisis in which some of us are present, but most of the world is basically saying, well, that can just be left for the moment because it doesn't threaten somebody else too much, maybe right or wrong. So I would like to plead, and it's not this humanitarian development peace nexus. I mean, this has become a formula in which everybody kind of, starts negotiating from one vantage point or another. We all belong to institutions. We have scopes, we have mandates, whether as a country such as Qatar, with your work on humanitarian, UNDP is working in most countries that are not in conflict and crisis, but one of the roles, and this is also why we cooperate with ACLED, is to actually be able to recognize where things are beginning to go wrong and to be able to intervene and not let a conflict become the driver of an international response, because this is where we have ended up. And then not being able to have the means in terms of policy, political levers, but also the funding, frankly, virtually every humanitarian appeal, and you have often spoken to this, David, also, is funded at maybe 20, 25, 30% right now. We are chronically underfinancing the humanitarian response, but we're also spending an inordinate amount on humanitarian response that don't necessarily combine with the ability to help societies come out of conflict. And I think one of the greatest failures to me is meeting people who were born in a refugee camp to a parent who first fled to that refugee camp. It offends me in the way that we are unable to do better. Thank you.
Can I just jump in before Majid does it? I understand what you're saying, Achim, but Majid's point is the greatest predictor of a conflict next door is the greatest predictor of a conflict is if there's a conflict next door. I mean, his point about Sudan is the ramifications of the Sudan conflict are rippling out. And so while your point about prevention is telling, his point is we've got so many conflicts going on. You think about Gaza, the way that's rippling out. Unless we can get to grips with peace making, we're never going to have the scope for peace building. And it strikes me that, maybe I should have made this point earlier, that the notion of a civil conflict is it happens within a country. His point, I think, and this is why I'd love you to come in on this, Majid, your point is a civil conflict never just stays within the nation. It ripples out beyond. If you think about what's happening in West Africa at the moment, telling examples there as well. So if we're not careful, we're going to argue, are you for prevention or are you for treatment? No, his point is that the treatment is a form of prevention.
Just one point. I don't think the world is that different because conflicts could be civil conflicts. They, in the past, also were stirred by regional or global powers. I'm not sure that that is the new phenomenon. But I don't think we're disagreeing, and I'm particularly wanting to not set up a humanitarian peace development segmentation. I think it is in our lacking ability to connect these different tools of intervention that we can work along a spectrum of trying to prevent, when a crisis breaks out, respond in a life-saving way, but at the same time, don't wait until people are all in refugee camps and then say, well, now let's start investing in recovery or reconstruction. I think we need to find a much more simultaneous form of deployment. Sometimes difficult for humanitarians because of this particular view of humanitarian law, the right to intervene. You know, well, let me stop here because it's your turn. Yeah, but I think there is not necessarily a disagreement, but I think where is the greatest hope for leveraging?
No, I'm happy with you guys explaining what I say. So that's. No, I mean, I do think we're all in agreement here on a lot of the things that were said. Yeah. I mean, let's look at some of the conflicts taking place right now and where they came from. Right? And I think that will be a proof of concept to what we were saying here. So when we look at the situation in Gaza today, it didn't happen in a silo, it didn't happen in a vacuum like Guterres and got them in a lot of trouble. But the thing is, it's a byproduct of violence in that region, violence right next door, in Lebanon, in Syria, and in other places. The lack of stability in the immediate region as a whole. And it comes, if you go back, you can't even put a point where that started, right? It's very, very difficult to decide because it's just a continuous cycle of violence. But the problem is every time a conflict is frozen, and I'm sorry to say that we haven't been ending any conflicts for a really long time. Every time a conflict is frozen, the repercussions of that conflict are not dealt with. The way we deal with conflict today is we sign a deal between the Taliban and the United States, wonderful. Forget about Afghanistan, let's go somewhere else. And then you just keep the situation frozen in Afghanistan waiting for the next conflict, right? And this is something that we've been really frustrated with people who work on the negotiation side, on our side, is every time we reach a deal to do something, everybody disappears, right? The international community stops. You guys get less funding to do things wherever it is needed, and we get less help in doing the mediation. And I'm quite sure if the war ended today in Gaza, within a couple of months, people will forget about the Palestinian issue. People will forget about the peace process, and it will become a matter of, well, we can't do something like it now. We have to wait. We'll see. And then just disappears. With Sudan, it's the same thing. When the coup happened, when the revolution or coup, whatever you want to call it, when the coup happened, it was obvious to everybody working within the Sudanese that this is a recipe for disaster in the near future. And there was very little done in the international community to help phase that out. I think it's important to understand conflict today in a way that we need to admit, because something you said, David, is I mean, emotionally, it's nerve-wracking for, I think, everybody who's working on mediation and negotiation. We are negotiating over trucks of aid going in. So what's the ratio of hostage to food going into to Gaza? That's the kind of discussions we're having, not only in the Gaza file, in all of these conflicts. The use of humans as, civilian hostages as a leverage. The use of aid and food and electricity and water as leverage. This is the state of affairs right now in mediation. We'd love to mediate only on the conflict itself and say we shouldn't mediate on the humanitarian side, but then nobody will get any humanitarian aid. And the cost of, the cost of human life has been diminished in conflict in a way where it's even not within the parameters of the discussions how many people are dying in the conflict.
Thank you so much. I think one thing to reflect on, of course, is that many times after a conflict has been treated, the violence tends to evolve into something just as intense, but in a different form. Colombia is a good example of this after that mediation. We have some very brief moments for some questions or comments, and I would love to hear from the audience. Yes, Mr. Keating.
Hi, my name's Michael Keating. I used to be the UNSRSG in Somalia. I now run the European Institute of Peace. My question is, do politicians, you were a politician, David, and you've now got the experience you have. Do you think politicians are sufficiently alert to the issues we're talking about? I mean, Majid, you were saying short-termism, transactional, elections-driven, addressing problems that don't lend themselves to that kind of treatment. To what degree do you feel that politicians understand some of the issues that we are talking about now? Do you know more now than you did when you were, as it were, in the hot seat as a politician?
Ursula Tsevich, the head of Ukraine Forum in London-based Chatham House. Thanks for the opportunity. First, I wanted to ask David to reflect on what's happening with the P5. The nuclear state is attacking a state that relinquished nuclear weapons. And this is, I think, where we are at the moment of history. Very, very dangerous moment. And also on a kind of, we cannot have a silver bullet from all conflicts. We in Chatham House are looking at resilience to foreign interference. And what we see a lot, there's a 5-dimensional work that has to happen in society, even with quite consolidated democracies, with fragile democracies, across the cognitive resilience with the disinformation, across the economic agility, across, human security, something you mentioned, across, working on accountable governance. So I think we have to devise new tools to give us and give policymakers opportunities to be aware where their soft underbelly is and work together with private sector, with civil society. So we're trying to do something called resilience barometer. If we are in any way successful, we'll share whatever. We did a pilot in Moldova. We hear a lot about Moldova now, right? What's going to happen if Russians are successful in its hybrid destabilization of Moldova? So, I mean, these are the things on my mind. Thanks.
Can we address those, please, within the time?
Thanks a lot. Let me start with the second question and then go to the first. Look, there is no P5 other than as a description of the 5 countries that wield a veto. The idea of the P5 as a coherent group is a bygone age. I mean, that is the geopolitical fragmentation that we are living with. To be fair to the US national security strategy, it says up front, geopolitical fragmentation is the first defining feature of the modern world. It recognizes shifts in global political and economic power. And the middle powers argument that Majid has made is very much part of this, but the P5 is no longer a coherent force. It's defined by the opposition between them rather than by the united responsibilities of them. And the fact that Russia should have invaded Ukraine is the ultimate example of the breakdown of the sense that there is an international order. It relates, though, to Michael Keating's question. The second thing that the US national security strategy says is that alongside geopolitical fragmentation, there is growing global risk. We all know that. COVID, nuclear risks, environmental risks, economic risks. And I'd like to answer Michael Keating's question in the following way. Politicians know that risks are global, but politics is local, not just democratic politics, because it's not only democratic nations where governments live in coalition with their own people. Just look at the Chinese response on zero COVID, and you can see that it's not only in countries with electoral systems that popular feeling is felt. Here's my point. The global risks are growing because of growing global interconnectedness. So we're living in an age of growing global risks. But because politics is local, resilience is local. And that creates a gap, the gap between the global risks and the local resilience. And I believe that gap explains why we're in such a mess at the moment.
I'm going to make a mess of this panel unless I finish it. So I will say that I've really enjoyed the insights, of course, whether it's about the gap and the limited number of countries that we should focus on as a reflection of what's going on in the world, or the prevention rhetoric about looking to see where problems are manifesting and dealing with them when they are right-sized. And of course, the coalition of middle powers that can come together to deal with some of these challenges. It's been a fantastic session, and I thank you very much. And of course, I thank our esteemed panelist very much.
45 hours, 45 minutes.